Go ahead.
So Zina, just to be clear, would you like me to speak to the ACE study as well as IPCA, or what would you like my focus to be here?
Well, the ACE study talks about being the children of people who are embroiled in this persistent U.S. legal system abuse. And the numbers have been documented about because the ACE study measured how many children are dealing with the family courts. So we have some sense of how big this problem is just based on the number of children who get caught up in family courts and have that adverse child experience. Now, with regard to the ICPA, when you're done talking about the ACE study, feel free to, because that is an international consideration, so feel free to tell us about that as well.
Okay, so there was I'd like to address initially something that was said earlier, and I apologize, I don't know the gentleman who was speaking. Somebody that's there in the room with you was talking about how with he clearly was referring to the family court, how we can discuss with friends and family what we've experienced in the court system. And as he said, he used the word unbelievable. And some of these stories seem unbelievable. And he also mentioned that it can get to the point where a court might request that somebody take part in a psychological evaluation. And there's a psychological term for what he ultimately was describing, which is called the fundamental attribution error. And so as an example, and this is just, I'm expanding upon what he said, and it does all tie into the ACE study as well as IPCA. The fundamental attribution error essentially equates someone's behavior with something that's believed to be an internal flaw, so to speak. So as an example, somebody goes into court, and in the example of a family court, it could be a father or a mother, and they go into court and they're either crying, they're extremely sad, they may be expressing anger, and the judge may look at this person and say, well, clearly this man or this woman is a very angry person, and we need to protect the child from this very angry person. And that's a fundamental attribution error, meaning that the person isn't necessarily on a day-to-day basis living in an angry state. And yet when they go into the courtroom and hypothetically, they haven't seen their child in 5 years or 5 months, and not to mention that morning they lost their wallet and their car was stolen, whatever it may be, and the person is, yes, in an angry state. And that means that it's a response to an external stimulus, not an internal flaw of the person in question. And so what happens in court oftentimes, and this is what he essentially was talking about, how these cases seem so unbelievable, and then suddenly you're sent for a psychological evaluation, it's because they are attributing an emotional state or a behavior as an internal flaw or characteristic of the person, as opposed to the external circumstance that is creating within the person, for example, the emotion of anger. So I just wanted to touch on that a little bit. And you just a few moments ago used the word resilience, and that's a key word. One's ability to be resilient, and how much can they take, how resilient can they be before they cross the threshold and the resilience starts to deteriorate. And that's a key component of the ACE study. So just for informational purposes, how many people, how much time do I have?
I'm checking.
It's 11:40.
It's about 11:40, and we're supposed to be breaking for lunch at 11:45. How can we be a little?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Can we do lunch at 12?
Yeah.
Would that work? Okay. So I'm just curious, how many people either there with you or remotely know about the adverse childhood experience study, the ACE study? Anybody? No? Okay. So that in and of itself is interesting and common, by the way, that many people have not heard of the ACE study, albeit the ACE study is the largest public health study ever conducted by the Center for Disease Control in the United States. And one of my theories as to why the ACE study is not known by the masses is because who governs the CDC? Health and Human Services. And certainly within the family court system, the injustices that go on are ultimately a function of money and how the courts are funded. Although the criminal court is not my area of expertise, one might argue as well that the criminal court system is ultimately a business, as is the prison system. So oftentimes we have people in this country who are incarcerated because they've been wrongfully convicted of a crime they didn't commit. And we're all familiar with cases like that that have happened over the years. Suddenly someone's released from prison 27 years later because a DNA test shows or proves they didn't commit the crime. So all this ties together. So so it goes back to money. And so specific to the ACE study, adverse childhood experience study, very briefly, the history of the ACE study is a doctor by the name of Vincent Folletti was part of Kaiser Permanente in San Diego, California, and this started in the 1980s. And he actually was running an obesity clinic. And people were coming into his clinic, and these are people that were losing 100 pounds, 200 pounds, et cetera, et cetera. And the program was very, very successful. And yet he had a very high dropout rate, which bewildered him. He didn't understand, if this is working, why are people dropping out? So he decided to go out and begin to interview the people who had dropped out of the program, even though they had lost a substantial amount of weight. And he would then begin to chart weight through the lifespan of the person up until the age that they were currently at. And inadvertently, it wasn't really a planned question, and it was not a question he had asked in the past. He was interviewing a woman who had been in the program. She had dropped out. And as he tells the story, he sort of inadvertently asked the question, how much did you weigh when you had your first sexual experience? And her response was 40 pounds. And he thought she must have misunderstood the question, and he rephrased it, asked essentially the same question again, and she burst into tears and she said 40 pounds. And of course, what that meant and what she ultimately revealed was that as a young child, she was sexually abused. So as he started to interview more and more people, he would ask that question, and more he was finding that people who had dropped out had either been sexually abused or physically abused or emotionally abused as young children. And then, of course, he thought, how could this be possible? I mean, if it's so prevalent, why doesn't everyone know about it? And just to make sure there was no bias based on him or how he was asking the questions, he sent out some of his colleagues, some male, some female, to do the interviews and ask the same question. And ultimately the response was the same. So now he had tapped into something. And he then connected with Dr. Robert Anda, who at the time was with the Center for Disease Control, and they collaborated and formulated and did what is now referred to as the adverse childhood experience. So ACE is adverse childhood experience. And what does that mean? The ACEs defined could be children that were subjected to physical abuse or neglect, emotional abuse or neglect, sexual abuse. Could be if they had a parent who commits suicide. It could be witnessing one parent abuse the other parent, a parent who's using drugs, and the one that's probably most relevant to family court would be divorce or separation of a child from a biological parent, which is considered an ACE. And currently in this country, there are roughly 24 million children that do not have a biological parent in their life. And these are not the parents that walked away from their children. These are parents, as myself, who want to be in their child's life, but either because of the other parent and or the court system, they are unable to be in their child's life. And so the study tracked over 500,000 people who carried encoded trauma from their childhood into their teenage years and their adult life. And the findings are pretty devastating. And as the ACE score goes up, so the more ACEs one has, the more likely these symptoms are to occur. And so just to give you an overview, exponentially as an example, ACE children are exponentially more likely to drop out of high school, to have teenage pregnancies, to smoke cigarettes, to commit suicide, to abuse alcohol, to use illegal drugs, to engage in a more at-risk behavior. As an example, ACE children are more likely to have broken bones because they engage in at-risk behavior. And as they go through their life, they are exponentially more likely to have disease, from coronary heart disease to diabetes to high blood pressure to cancer, so on and so forth. And when it's all said and done, to statistically die at a much younger age. So there is an ACE pyramid that's very common. You can Google it and you'll see at the top, it ends with early death. So how does this tie into the court system? The court system, specifically family court, is really a business based on generating revenue. And the phrase best interest of the child is really a meme, because ultimately the courts operate in a way that is, how do they make the most money? And it all goes back to how the family court is funded. So there's Title 4D and Title 4E of the Social Security Act going back to 1975. In the 90s, Clinton signed what's referred to as the Adoption and Safe Families Act. That was actually 1997. And ultimately, the courts are financially incentivized to essentially award custody of a child to one parent, typically the lower income earner, because the higher income earner has higher income. They can then enforce more child support, and exponentially the court via the state, via the federal government, receives anywhere from $5 to $10 for every $1 in collected child support, which has created a debtor's prison and has made the court a business that is not in the best interest of the child. It's in the best interest of how does the court make money. Title 4E is more specific to social services, and CPS, there's various acronyms to DFCS, depends what state you're in, again, are incentivized based on how they're funded to ultimately remove children from biological families altogether and put children in foster care. And predominantly, most of the children put into foster care by agencies like CPS are physically abused, sexually abused, trafficked for sex, and in extreme cases, and more often than not, murdered. So trauma, you were mentioning, again, resilience. And in the world of trauma, and I do a lot of trauma work, and in the ACE study, they talk about the landscape of the brain, and this is very specific to encoded trauma. So for a trauma or for an event to be encoded in the brain as a traumatic memory, one is you have an event. So a child is taken away. Maybe the child's taken overseas. Then there's meaning. What does this mean in my life? What is the meaning that the person associates with the event? And then there's perceived inescapability. And again, the key word there is perceived. And what that means is they feel like there's no way out. Oftentimes when we talk about perceived inescapability with encoded trauma, people think of a physical escape. For example, the building's on fire and we're looking for the exit, but where's the door? Where's the window? We can't find our way out physically of where we are. But it goes beyond physical escape. It can be emotional escape or psychological escape. So with the court system, when one is repeatedly subjected to the injustices, or if I can go as far as say the corruption within the court system, there is a sense of perceived inescapability because somebody is dealing with massive corruption, massive injustice, and they feel there's no way out, there's no resolution, or there's no cure, there's no fix. And then the fourth component is landscape. And the landscape, which ultimately means the landscape of a person's brain during an encoding event, also is at play. And the landscape ultimately will determine the meaning, which I touched on just a moment ago. So when we talk about landscape, we're talking about the neurochemical landscape of a person's brain. And specific to children, when, we're hardwired as individuals for survival. And so we've all heard, fight, flight, freeze, right? And when we're in that mode, our body produces cortisol, norepinephrine, and adrenaline. And these are neurochemicals and neuromodulators that ultimately put us into survival mode. What do I need to do in this moment to stay alive? Now, the challenge with these neurochemicals is that in certain instances, they can save our lives. The flip side of the coin is when one's brain and body is subjected to excess levels of cortisol or norepinephrine or adrenaline, but especially cortisol, I would say, it affects the development of a brain. So with specific to children, excessive and constant cortisol production in their bodies affects their developing brain. And that leads to disrupted neurodevelopment. It leads to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment. It results in adoption of high-risk behaviors, as I mentioned earlier, and then, of course, disease, social problems, and ultimately early death. So the ACE study is extremely relevant to the court system because even as adults, even somebody who comes into the system with a resilient landscape, over time, that resilience, as you alluded to earlier, can be chipped away at. And then the landscape of their brain goes from resilient to vulnerable. Specific to IPCA, which is International Parental Child Abduction, that is a federal felony. It's section 1204, Title 18 of the United States Code. So I mention that because sometimes, and I get the response, and this goes back to, people we tell our stories to, and they think, how could that be? It doesn't seem believable. And so IPCA also is something that seems unbelievable. And oftentimes the response we get when we say, our child was kidnapped, or our children were kidnapped out of the country, and then we add by their mother or their father, oftentimes, and this certainly has been my experience, the response is, okay, they're with their mom, or they're with their dad, as if that makes it all okay. And it's not okay, which is why it's a federal felony, because separation from a biological parent is defined as an adverse childhood experience. And in this country, roughly, the numbers vary, some may not be reported, but on average, 1,500 to 2,000 children per year in this country are illegally removed from the country by one parent to isolate the child from another parent. And then, we go into the court system. Certainly the family court system is not at all familiar with international law. And even if they were, they're more apt to turn the other way because, again, of the financial incentives. And they don't recognize things such as ultimately what would be considered, generally speaking, as pathological enmeshment. Pathological enmeshment includes, as I mentioned earlier, the fundamental attribution error. It includes cognitive dissonance, which a child will experience when separated from a parent. Adultification, which is having the little 5-year-old make adult decisions. Psychological projection, which is essentially when one person accuses another person of an attribute. So in other words, they say, "Oh, he's abusive," and that's actually the person projecting their own behavior onto someone else. And the courts either don't recognize these things, or they turn a blind eye to these things because, again, they're financially incentivized to do so. Specific to IPCA, I'll just share briefly. There are systems in place, so to speak, to prevent IPCA and also to retrieve children that have been taken illegally. Unfortunately, however, many, if not most of, if not all of those systems are ineffective. I have here, I don't know if you can see it on the screen, but it's a very thick booklet. This is the 2017 annual report on international child abduction published by the US State Department. There are 195 countries in the world. 85 of those 195 countries, which is roughly 43%, are signatories to the Hague Convention. The Hague Convention, while it reads well on paper, is unfortunately, in most cases, ineffective. And in fact, in this report, country by country, it lists the countries that are, let's say, non-compliant. So they're members of they're signatories to the Hague Convention, but they're non-compliant, meaning a child is illegally abducted, taken to that country, and they are non-compliant in that they do not work with the United States in terms of returning the child as per the Hague Convention. And by the way, this also works in reverse because, quite frankly, there are children from other countries around the globe who are kidnapped from those countries and taken to the United States. And then the question is, how well does the United States do in honoring the Hague Convention that the United States is a signatory to, which maybe is where the United Nations can come in and help with all these countries that are non-compliant signatories to the Hague Convention. As far as countries that are non-compliant, or I'm sorry, non-signatories, so a parent doesn't have the option of even filing under the Hague Convention, then you have to, or one would have to pursue the child in a criminal matter. The Hague Convention is considered a civil proceeding, a civil pursuit, a civil suit. If that's not an option, or if that was an option but it failed, then the other alternative is to pursue the abducting parent through criminal means, which means getting the FBI involved, Interpol, getting federal warrants. And the problem there is that oftentimes the FBI, to present to the Attorney General of the state where the parent resides, in order for them to be willing to even prosecute the case, more often than not, they request that the parent be granted custody by the family court. And oftentimes the family court will not grant that custody to the parent. And certainly that's been the battle that I've been facing, and I'm still battling. So, and then just briefly, very quickly, I'd like to touch on the term parental alienation, because there's a misconception out there in terms of what is parental alienation. And most people, even the so-called experts, would say that parental alienation is something that a parent does to a child. It's something that happens to a child. And in fact, that actually is not the correct pathology. Parental alienation is actually the action of a child. And again, I go back to the word survival. We're hardwired for survival. So a young child that is taken by a pathogenic parent will align with the pathogenic parent and alienate the targeted parent as a means for survival. So it's not a flaw in the child, it's simply a survival mechanism response. It's, I would make an analogy to Stockholm Syndrome, where a hostage befriends the captor. And again, that's just a survival mechanism. And in these cases, the child has ultimately they've lost both parents. They've lost the targeted parent, who's a loving, healthy, caring, want to be in your life parent, and that parent's not there physically. And they've also, quite frankly, lost the other parent, the parent that's physically there, but has lost all emotional empathy for the child. And this leads the child to experience cognitive dissonance. And all these things add up over the lifespan of the child, which goes back to the ACE study in terms of what's going to happen in their teenage years and their young adult life, again, with at-risk behavior, suicide, dropping out of high school, abusing alcohol, using illegal drugs, and then the diseases, and again, statistically, early death. So through this forum and what we have discussed privately is ultimately how could the United Nations play a role in bringing all countries together for the benefit and the welfare of our children, because ultimately we as advocates are being a voice for the voiceless. And these are children who didn't have a say in what's happened to them. So it's my hope that beyond reform within the United States, that also perhaps with further work, we can get the United Nations to engage in playing a role in helping illegally kidnapped children be returned to their country of origin. And one last point, and I know I'm going slightly over the time, so I'll wrap up with this. The other issue that comes into play, quite frankly, is these countries that are holding our children hostage, so to speak, and being non-compliant are benefiting economically with the United States via trade agreements. So some of these countries are third world countries, and they have trade agreements with the United States, and that can be good for the United States, it can be good for the developing country, and yet they're holding children hostage. And one of the ideas is that there should be economic sanctions on these countries that are non-compliant with the return of children. And unfortunately, it seems that, and it's again a two-way street, that both the United States at the federal level and these other countries are more concerned about money than they are the welfare of a child. However, ultimately, in the long term, the cost on society far exceeds monies that these countries and in the United States, the states and the courts receive through the channels in which they're funded, which I mentioned earlier. The family court system in this country is roughly $80 billion a year, although when you cluster a group of ACE children together, the cost on society can run up to about $125 billion per year. And this goes to absenteeism from work, medical expenses, crime, and so on and so forth. So, you know, there's a very heavy cost on society as a whole, as well as a psychological and emotional cost on adults and parents. And ultimately, the ultimate victims are children who are our future. So I don't know if there's any questions or anything you'd like to add, but that sort of would be, I guess, an overview in the amount of time I have to briefly mention the ACE study, IPCA, and how both are connected to the current court system as we know it.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. We're going to break for lunch, and I think Dr. Gopal is scheduled to come in at 1 p.m. Dr. Gopal, are you? Is your schedule tight? Should we come back exactly at 1? Do you need a little bit of flexibility, 1:10, 1:15, or you want us to get started right at 1?
Whatever works for you is fine with me. Honestly, I'm quite flexible.
Okay, then. Well, we'll convene back right at 1:15, which is 12:15 your time. It's good to see you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Enjoy lunch.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Scott. Our wonderful presentation.
Okay, great. Thanks.